Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. Our topic tonight is the top 13 Illuminati bloodlines. As prophecy students, we have all heard people say, well, they want to bring in a new world order. They want world government. They want world religion. They want the mark of the beast. Well, who is the they? Our speaker tonight is going to answer that question, who is the they? Not only that, but their plans and how they plan to bring us into this global satanic conspiracy government, economy, and religion. Our speaker has, for the last 6 years, deprogrammed people from different mind control, top Illuminati people that were wanting to get out of it. He has deprogrammed, debriefed over 24 different people. He's author of the top 13 Bloodlines of the Illuminati, and also this book, The Illuminati Formula Used to Create an Undetectable, Total Controlled, Mind-Controlled Slave, and 13 other books. Will you help me welcome Fritz Springmeier?
Before I get started with my talk, I have a few words to say. First, it's a great pleasure and a great privilege to be here with you. It's very important that you feel a part of what I've got to say tonight, because what I've got to say tonight is going to affect your life and your children's lives and the lives of future generations, if there are any. I'm not trying to frighten anyone, but I do need to tell us about the situation, the dangerous situation that we are in today. Ladies and gentlemen, like you were told, I have co-authored with Cisco Wheeler 2 books on the New World Order's mind control. And this small version here has a Japanese translation to it. Many of us Christians are not afraid to be thrown into prison because we realize that we are free in Christ no matter where we are, and they are the slaves. No matter where they are, because they're slaves to sin. However, with today's sophisticated mind control technology, they have the ability to strip us of our own thoughts. We can no longer depend upon having a situation where our mind and our thoughts are our own. Now, I didn't write this book for myself, but I wrote this book, which for short is Volume 2. I wrote this book for the church so that they could come to the fullness and measure and stature of Christ, and also for humanity. We're rapidly approaching a point in time where everybody who thinks is only going to be thinking what they are programmed. Now, you can stay in denial and turn your back on humanity, or you can read this book and then pass this information on to others. I want to get the word out, but I can't do it all by myself. I need your help. Getting this Volume 2 book won't just help me, won't just help Prophecy Club, but will help humanity in general. And even the children can help. They can pray for those of us that are trying to get the message out. Now, I also need to warn you that this talk is not going to be politically correct. But as a Christian in a nation where it's politically correct for 330 congressmen to write 20,000 bad checks over a period of 3 years, and as a Christian in a nation where it's politically correct for groups like Planned Parenthood to sue a high school in Florida which is trying to teach abstinence in sex to its unmarried high schoolers. While on the other side of the nation, in L.A., you have a school district which is beginning to think that there might be some relationship between their free condom program and their sex education class and the high rate of teenage pregnancy. So they do the politically correct thing. They offer a class in creative masturbation. As a Christian in a nation like this, I enjoy being politically correct just a notch below AIDS. Admiral Stanfield Turner, in August of 1977, before a Senate committee, revealed to this committee that, yes, the CIA was doing mind control on countless numbers of Americans who were, and this was being done without their consent, and he even told some of the methods that they use: hypnosis, electroshock, drugs. This is a newspaper article from the time period, and here you see listed one of their programmers. Hey, Smack, what are your 4 answers? Yes, sir. No, sir. No excuse, sir. Sir, I do not understand. I entered West Point on July 3rd, 1973, and was the first 2 months there are called beast barracks. That's where they tear you down and they build you into the soldier that they want you to be. Now, I knew there was something wrong about West Point, but it's taken me years to really get the full picture. But between my first and my second year, I went over to the Holy Lands, and it was right after the Yom Kippur War. And they had just won a tremendous victory, but they had won nothing. And for me, as a Christian, it really showed how ludicrous it was, how insane it was for us to fight these wars for the politicians. And it especially drove home the point that there are lots of men that will fight for the system, but there are only a few men that are willing to fight with that dedication in the Lord's army. So I took the lesson that I had learned at West Point, and that one lesson was obedience, and I decided to apply that to my Christian life. When somebody asked me to do something, when they gave me an order at West Point, I didn't ask, am I going to do this? But I simply responded, how am I going to do this? And so in my second year, I resigned from West Point with only one goal in my life. That was to serve Christ without reservation. Whatever your will is, Lord, I want to obey you like I have been taught to obey the army. And so it didn't matter what the Lord was going to tell me, how silly or how ridiculous it might be, I was going to do that. So when we start looking for the Lord, where do we go? Well, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning was a symbol, and the symbol was with God, and the symbol was God. Symbols are very important. We use them to organize, to design, to communicate, to observe our world. Symbols are what elevate us above animals. And I think that in Satan's bag of tricks, just the manipulation of symbols alone is a tool that's capable of controlling mankind. This is a very interesting use of symbols. A friend of mine who worked for the New World Order, very high up in the New World Order, and he was one of their mind-controlled slaves. He had been part of the Illuminati, and one day his photographic memory wrote down this formula. He said that the tetragrammaton, which is the symbol that stands for God, equaled a formula for DNA. And I'm not saying it does or doesn't. I thought this was a very interesting use of symbols. My friend was to visit me on January 12th. on January 11th, he was murdered. So when we begin to look for God, where do we start? Well, if we decide that there's no God, we have placed ourselves in the position known as atheism, or the same position that some Buddhists have placed themselves in. But if we decide that there are gods or a God, then we have another choice to make. Are there many gods or one God? If we decide that there are many gods, then we have decided to take the position known as polytheism, which is the same as Mormonism, the New Age movement, Greek and Roman mythology, Hinduism. But if we decide that there is one God, then we come down here and we can decide whether he is identified with the universe or whether he is distinct from the universe. If we say that he is identified with the universe, we have taken the position known as pantheism and panentheism, which is Zen Buddhism and Christian Science. But if we say that he is distinct from the universe, then we have a choice. Is he finite or infinite? If he is finite, then we have placed ourselves in the position that the Watchtower Society of the Jehovah's Witnesses took. There's a little known doctrine that they promulgated the first half of their history, and most Jehovah's Witnesses are not aware of it. But the leadership that they have today, which is old, was around when they promulgated this doctrine, and they haven't repudiated it, so we have to assume that they still hold to it. And that doctrine was that God was a finite being, like you or I, and he lived in the star constellation, the Pleiades. You've heard of Pleiadians. And this was specifically on the star Alcyon, and he sent messages to the governing body of the Watchtower Society from Alcyon, and it took 8 days. But if we say that God is infinite, then we come down here and can make the choice that he never does miracles, or he sometimes does miracles. If he never does miracles, that's what's known as deism. The rational thinkers of the 1700s thought that way, like Thomas Jefferson. However, a lot of those men were closet occultists. But then we can also decide that he sometimes does miracles, and this places us into this category known as theism, which is typified by the faith of Abraham and many of the types of your mainstream monotheistic religions. So, how do we know what's truth? If we go back to the beginning, we will find out that there were two sources of truth. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there was the tree of life in the garden. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil includes worldly knowledge of what is right and wrong. It's the letter of the law of God, and the dead religion based on compliance to the dead letter of the law. It's man-made compliance to law and man-made changes in outward behavior. It's a focus on self. If we focus on ourself, we can go two directions. We can indulge and become licentious, or we can go the other route, which is a problem in some churches. We can become self-righteous. It also includes a false trust that worldly philosophy and other fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil will expose Satan. It will not expose Satan. Why? Because Satan appears as an angel of light. Remember how much we have placed in the basket as it was passed around? Satan was willing to give Christ the entire world on the mountaintop. How's that for a donation? The fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil will not expose Satan. This is what is called in Scripture the flesh. It leads to death, not to mention also producing in the mind lasciviousness, double-mindedness, and pride in what one knows. It's the goodness of man, and it's very popular. But the other tree in the garden, it included a fear of God, peace, God-centered knowledge, which is relevant to what God is doing, therefore wisdom. It's the spirit of the law, a living faith and a relationship with Yahweh God. Its spirit made changes in the heart. It focuses on Christ, the Spirit, and the Heavenly Father. It exposes Satan and his influences by correctly using the living Word of God written by the Spirit, along with the guidance of the Spirit. It's what the Scriptures call the Spirit. It leads to life, not to mention a renewed sound mind and humility to learn from others and from the Master Teacher. It's the goodness of God. And it's very unpopular because a natural man doesn't receive the things of God because they're foolishness to him. But there was a problem. Satan came into the garden and brought evil. And this has produced a logic problem. For here we have a God who's omniscient, all-knowing, and a God that's omnipotent, almighty, and yet we're told that he's wholly good, and yet something that this wholly good, all-knowing, all-powerful God, something that he has created, has evil in it. Now this problem has faced all of us on a subconscious or a conscious level. In fact, it was such a problem with philosophers in the 1940s that a number of them began writing books and philosophical systems. They were writing books to expose Christianity and other religions as being illogical, especially because of this logic problem. One of these men lived in Boston, and he worked for decades writing a book exposing the illogic of Christianity because of this logic problem. In the early 1960s, he realized that his philosophical system had the same logic problem. In fact, even though he didn't become a Christian, he realized that the Bible had a lot to tell us. And so he spent the next decade writing a book explaining how much Christianity did have to offer. But a lot of us, we go to our clergyman and we ask him about this problem of evil, and we're given insufficient answers. We're told, just have faith. Or we're told, there's no contradiction. Or the answer is so smooth, but by the time they're finished, all these terms are devoid of their usual meanings and are vague. Or perhaps it's declared to us that we only see through a glass darkly. These insufficient answers leave many reasonable persons deeply disturbed by the absurdity of conventional belief in God. Some have decided that human life is self-defeating, tragic, and absurd. There's better answers. But you may be wondering, why is Fritz focusing on this when time is so short in this talk, and we all know that there's a problem with evil, and we all deal with this logic problem? Well, the reason why is because the good Lord called me to do three things. First, expose evil, then give hope, and then call people back to the Word of God. If you have a prophetic ministry, it's very easy, if you don't expose evil, to give flippant hope. Oh, just vote the characters out of office. See? But on the other side, it's very easy to expose evil and then walk away without giving people hope. But if you're doing like I'm trying to do, to expose evil to the very depths of evil, it's very hard to give people hope. So this is very important to our discussion today. There are better answers. For instance, to show that every mathematical, scientific, and philosophical system has vagueness and contradictions within their principles. Philosophers cannot define and defend their own criteria of meaning without employing self-defeating arguments. All philosophy and mathematical systems have paradoxes when one pushes to get total clarity of terms. One has to either accept A, some vagueness of terms, or B, accept paradox with extremely clear terms. Next, common sense of human existence means we must accept the contradictions that accompany the complexity of the sense and nonsense of our spiritual environment. Life is full of nonsense. If you try to write a computer program to decide whether somebody loved you, and they squeeze your toothpaste from the middle of the tube, and the computer program kicks it out that they don't love you. Life is full of a lot of nonsense. It can't be broken down into logic. The problem of evil is actually a sign that reveals that there are deep issues of life that must be plumbed, like a crack in the earth's crust that plunges out of sight. Now, evil is not out of control. God has said, I will establish a point in time here that I'll allow evil to begin, and evil can continue until this point in time. And then he showed us that in between these 2 points, all evil can be turned to good, and the proof of that is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. God can view evil in a different view because he is above time and knows that with his unlimited power, all things will work for good to them that love God. God has unlimited power to bring something good out of evil. Proof of this ability is the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. In order to bring true love into human existence, God had to allow choice, which includes the choice of rejection and disobedience by his creation. After a period of allowing mankind to choose to love him, God promises to destroy evil. But there's another thing that sin brought. We're talking about trauma. As I started to work with these people under Illuminati mind control, this mind control is often called trauma-based mind control. I realized that what was being done on a very intense scale was actually being done on a looser scale to all of us. We're traumatized. And we're traumatized for a reason, to program us a lie. It's very important we catch on to this. First, a trauma is applied. Second, a lie is offered which, when accepted, alleviates or improves the pain of the trauma. And third, systems of lies are built to trap us within the confines of the lies we believe in. For instance, imagine we're thousands of years ago in India, and we are traumatized, and because this is demonic-based, the lie has told us, if you worship this phallus, this lingam, why, your pain will be alleviated. And we do. And because this is all demonic-based, why we have some alleviation of the pain. And then our culture makes this a tradition, and we are all trapped into the lie. Now here's another example. A Christian's life is cut short by Satan. The lie that is offered the survivors is God owes every person a full, happy, prosperous 70 to 80-year life. God is then blamed. Why did God let this happen? The resulting bitterness opens up a door for a person to get into immorality, which further entraps the person. The reality is, if God gave us what we deserved, in our weak, sinful nature, none of us would be alive, because mankind is in rebellion to God, their Creator. People need to focus on what they have received from God, not what we haven't received. To focus on what wasn't given, rather than the great gifts that have been given, is ungratefulness. Therefore, when a trauma is applied to our life, we can use that trauma to program a lie into our life, or we can grow spiritually by seeing the deeper spiritual realities that the trauma is trying to teach us. And again, recapping all of this, Christ's life is proof that God has the ability to turn evil into good. And God has told us that He will use suffering to take our eyes off of trivial things, so that we can see deeper eternal realities. He also tells us that suffering will develop our faith, virtue, knowledge, self-control, endurance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. As we are taught in 1 Peter, but the God of all grace, who hath called us unto his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, settle you. And we are also receiving suffering to prove that we're a royal priesthood. And here is Apostle Paul, and he's talking to the philosophers of his day at the Areopagus, and he's going, idols, idols everywhere, even an idol to an unknown God. And here he is again with the Acropolis in the background, talking to the philosophers of his day. I've come to tell you about an unknown God, and if you want to read what Paul told the philosophers of the ancient world, read in Acts 17. Now we talked about the Spirit of God leading us into all truth, the tree of life. And the Spirit revealed this to me, and then he confirmed that by giving the same revelation to other brothers, who then I subsequently met. This is how paradise runs, or how it's sustained. We're looking at the real before we look at the counterfeit. It's very interesting. The Spirit revealed that God's attributes themselves are what sustain paradise. And if we look at how we define God, or what God is, we find that those are the elements that make up the New Jerusalem. Now, the basic structure of paradise is a cube, and this has some inherent attributes to it. For instance, it's stable. On the bottom, we find true love. Now, I might interject here. I'm not teaching this as a new doctrine. I'm just presenting it to you so that to help you picture or understand how things work. On the top is God's order, authority and authority covering. And then we find on the rest of the cube justice, truth, equity, and life. And there are books that could be written about this revelation, but we are just briefly covering it. In contrast with this, this is the world system that Satan has set up. And it's a double pyramid structure. This was again given to me by revelation of God, and again it was confirmed by other brothers who received similar revelation. But what was very interesting was confirmation from an unexpected source. That was Norman Dodd. Norman Dodd was the chief investigator of the Reese Committee in 1953. Congress established the Reese Committee to investigate the un-American activities of the foundations. Norman Dodd had lived and worked around the movers and shakers of the world his entire life. He was a banker, amongst other things. And these movers and shakers, many of them Illuminati, they thought that Norman Dodd was one of them. So they freely talked to him. But at one point, after having rubbed shoulders with them for years, he realized how they were running the world. And he put together this model, and he showed it to Alexander Sachs, one of the most powerful men at that time in the nation. And Alexander Sachs said, I can't stay here in the room and listen to you explain this if you want to be alive. That's how right on it was. There are 6 elements to this world system. Order, represented by the state, wisdom, values, justice, the courts, truth, the church, wealth, the prices, and equity, the market. And I've added to what Norman Dodd had as just wealth, I've added health on there as a function of that. This is a double pyramid. It has some intrinsic things to it too. The base supports the top. And you have a mirror image on the bottom. You will also find that the cube shape is talked about in Scripture as being the structure of paradise. It's the shape that the New Jerusalem is in. It's the shape that the Holy of Holies is in. And we are also told in Matthew that we are the salt of the earth, and a salt crystal is the shape of a cube. Likewise, there's some scriptures that talk about this shape being a satanic shape. And interestingly, too, there are some scriptures that use the word stoicheia in them, approximately 6 of these, and Bible scholars have been scratching their heads wondering, what does stoicheia mean? If we go back to the classical Greek, we will see that they use the word to mean elements that make up something, that comprise something. I believe that when the scriptures warn us not to be deceived by the elements of the world, that they're referring to these elements, even though they're not spelled out. And originally when I had put together this talk, I was going to go in and show how each of these different elements of the world system was controlled by the Illuminati. But this talk doesn't have that much time. So we are only going to briefly talk about some of these things. But I want you to be aware that there is information that will show how each of these elements are controlled. Now this next diagram is extremely important to our discussion today. And it will tie in with a lot of things that we say as we go through our discussion. This is the way Satan creates a Gnostic religion. There are 3 components to a Gnostic religion. I discovered this reading in an obscure Gnostic book in an obscure paragraph. And all of a sudden I realized they've just told me how they do it. Remember back in the Garden of Eden, Satan said, this knowledge will save you. That's saving knowledge. That's Gnosticism. Okay? So then the next step is they realized knowledge is power. And they realized that if you say, I have hidden knowledge, people have to come to you for that hidden knowledge. You create an instant power base. So the first element that Satan uses in setting up a Gnostic religion is hidden knowledge. Now the next thing is you can't give away all your hidden knowledge at once, or you've just given away your power base. So you have to dish it out in increments. If you're a Mason, you receive it incrementally as you go through an initiate degree system. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you receive it incrementally by staying in touch with, and this is a direct quote, God's channel of communication. You incrementally receive Watchtower and Awake magazines. Or if you're in some Pentecostal churches that make you dependent upon this prophet who has revelation knowledge that no one else can give you, then that's another example of how this hidden knowledge makes you dependent upon a religious system. Now the next criteria, the next thing that they use in setting up a Gnostic religion is that you can't get the devotion from the common masses that you can from an initiate group. So you set up 2 different religions. You set up one for the broad masses and one for the initiates. And then you establish a cover ruling body, and then at the top, the key men are Satanists. So let's take the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. There we've got the great crowd who are promised life on earth. And then we've got the anointed, promised heaven, and then their governing body, and then their key men. In 1991, I came out with a reference book, Be Wise as Serpents, which was 800 pages, sort of like a Young's Concordance of the New World Order. And I tried to go through many different groups and show how they had been created and how they were being manipulated and controlled. And, for instance, with the Jehovah's Witnesses, here up at the top, we've got a man named Nathir Salih. He was an Iraqi Jew and he loves nice, expensive jewelry. And the president of the Watchtower Society, the late one, Freddie Franz, recently died, for many years, for many decades, had been on his deathbed. And he was considered to be the leader of the Watchtower Society. Nobody even knew about Nathir Salih, but whenever there needed to be a decision by this man on his deathbed, who died at 99, Nathir Salih would go into his room and come out with the answer. Now another man that was ties in with this is someone who's on the governing body who's a Rhodes Scholar. In fact, Freddie Franz was offered to be a Rhodes Scholar, but turned it down so that he would be in a position to take over the Watchtower Society. Now, if we take this structure with its three components that I've just outlined to you, and we turn it on its side, this pyramid structure on its side, we come up with something that looks like a pie. Now, think about this. Here on the outside, we've got like a Catholic and a Mormon and a Jehovah's Witness. This is the perfect control mechanism. The Catholic out here is fighting the Mormon, who's fighting the Jehovah's Witness, is fighting somebody else. None of them ever rebel against the sinner. Very few of them ever realize they're being controlled by the sinner. If they ever do rebel against the sinner, they are stopped by the initiate group, the clergy. For instance, in the Catholic Church, your broad masses would be your laity, and your initiate group would be your clergy, and then your cardinals would be your cover ruling body, and then your key men would be Satanists. Or within your Mormons, you would have your Melchizedek priesthood and your Aaronic priesthood, your Melchizedek priesthood, and then your 70 and whatnot at LDS headquarters, and then your key men there. So some of these of the priesthood that are being a buffer to protect the sinner, some of them are actually going to believe in the religion, and some of them are just going to be in it because that's how they make a living. But at any rate, it's the perfect protection for the sinner. And these people and the sinner all know each other. They are your Illuminati. And Satan knows when you go to a restaurant, you like a variety. So all of these groups are patterned on that pie-shaped thing that I just gave you, that pyramid. And my apologies to Baskin-Robbins, there's more than 31 flavors there. And this is just showing you, I want to briefly mention one other thing about this diagram here. These boundaries between the different pieces of pie are artificial boundaries. Satan can pull those out anytime he wants, and we see glimpses of that every now and then, like at the World Parliament of Religion, where Hindus and Buddhists and Indian shamans and Satanists and Chuck Colson, representing the Protestants, got together and prayed. And as a little bit of a tidbit of what I'm saying, this is a Jewish father who's bringing Mary worship to the Jews. But the pyramid structure is too easy for people to see, so they've taken the deception to another height. They've created what's called the spin principle, segmented polycentric integrated network. This is and here the spin principle is demonstrated by New Age teaching institutions. What you do is you set up many little what look like grassroots organizations. They're all spinning the same direction, and then if somebody tries to take one down, all they get is one little node, and the network remains. And here's another example of the spin principle. This is by New Age groups, and this next transparency no longer applies since about 1950 because they're merging all the religions together. But originally the Illuminati worked behind fronts. Satan's empire's like an onion with layer after layer, and you have to peel it back. So the Illuminati created and worked behind groups, mystical groups, which then in turn controlled and worked behind monotheistic groups. So Freemasonry behind Protestantism, Jesuits behind Roman Catholics, Frankists behind the Jews, Sufis behind the Islam. Now we're going to go through these next transparencies very quickly. They are part of a document packet I put together in 1990 and had for a while, but after offering them for a couple years, I think I got like one person who requested one. They're showing from their primary documents what they are trying to do. And here in this document, Manly Palmer Hall tells us that a secret governing body controls the globe. not the various religious governing bodies that pretend to rule. That's what I was trying to tell you with that diagram with the black circle in the middle of the pie. And who is Manly P. Hall? Manly P. Hall was a Grand Master in the Illuminati, and he was also a Grand Master in Freemasonry. And here is the Scottish Rite Journal's obituary of him: illustrious Manly Palmer Hall, often called Masonry's greatest philosopher. Now, this is from Alice Bailey. She wrote The Externalization of the Hierarchy, and she was head of Lucius Trust. And Lucius Trust, as so many of you already know, is a publishing company. Lucius Publishing is a publishing company for the United Nations. And it was originally known as Lucifer Publishing and Lucifer Trust. And Alice Bailey created 140 New Age religions, and she worked for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1957, establishing educational goals that are now being implemented in the United States. For instance, Global 2000. And she writes that Freemasonry will be the universal religion. Other New Age leaders like Benjamin Krim also say the same thing, that Freemasonry will be the new universal religion. And she says that between the church and esoteric groups and Freemasonry, there is no disassociation between all of these. This is just simply to show you that the next quotes are coming to you on the basis of the highest Masonic authority. This is Ancient Mystic Oriental Masonry, written by Clymer, a high-ranking Freemason. And he tells us that Masonry is connected to the ancient systems of priesthood. And he lists the different ancient systems of priesthood of the mystery religions. And he tells us that the Celts and the Brahmins and others, Ahura Mazda in Persia, and even the Pharisees, your Levites, Curites, Magi, Brahmins, Druids, they were connected by secret ties and intercommunicated from the Indus to the Tiber, from the Nile to the Thames. Hence there ever has been, is, and ever will be Freemasonry on our planet. What he's talking about is that inner black circle I was talking to you about. In the ancient world, there were many mystery religions, and each of those mystery religions had their councils. But men from those councils got together in a supra-council that controlled it all, and that was the Illuminati. Now, a lot of you have never probably heard much about that term before, so let's talk a minute about what the Illuminati is, what the word means. The mystery religions only went underground for a long period of time, but the priesthood always continued. You can't find any point in history where they were extinguished. And in 1776, they reorganized themselves as the Illuminati. The Illuminati is a continuation of the mystery religion. As an example of that, when I met the Illuminati Grand Master, and now he's an Ipsimus in the Illuminati, in our Northwest area, shook his hand, he had a ring on his finger, and if you go to Manly P. Hall's book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, on page C, which is 100, you'll find that he says that a silver ring with a snake swallowing its tail, it indicates rank in the mystery religions. And this Grand Master had a ring exactly like that. And here is from Clymer's book again, and it says, so broad is the religion of Masonry, and so carefully all sectarian tenets excluded from the system, that the Christian, the Jew, and the Mohammedan, and all their numberless sects and divisions, may and do harmoniously combine in its moral and intellectual work with the Buddhist, the Parsi, the Confucian, and the worshiper of deity under every form. That's also a direct quote from Mackey's Masonic Jurisprudence. So you have two Masonic authorities that are telling you the same thing, that Freemasonry is a universal religion. And here is Clymer again, and he says, Masonry was founded on the ancient wisdom religion, and when founded was not known as Freemasonry. And here is something from Morals and Dogma. When you become a 32nd degree Freemason, they give you Morals and Dogma to read and to carry around. And if you read in there, you will find that Albert Pike, who was the head of all Freemasonry in his day and known as the Pope of Freemasonry, says, Masonry is identical with the ancient mysteries. And this is from the Masonic House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., the Scottish Rites House of the Temple. And there's another room in this building, which is a 14 by 25 room with 13 chairs, where the Grand Druid Council of the Illuminati meets. And here's from another Freemason, high-ranking, Foster Bailey, and he says, little as it may be realized by the unthinking Mason who is interested only in the outer aspects of the craftwork, the whole fabric of Masonry may be regarded as an externalization of that inner spiritual group whose members down the ages have been custodians of the plan, and as those to whom has been committed the working out of the will of God for the race of men. They assist at the unfolding of the consciousness of the candidate until the time comes when he can enter into light and in his turn become a light bearer, one of the Illuminati who can assist the lodge on high in bringing humanity to light. So he's telling us here that if you are selected as a Freemason, you may be able to go on and be one of the Illuminati. Here are a few of our presidents who were Freemasons in their Masonic garb. George Washington, Andrew Johnson, and you see William McKinley there, and William Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, and FDR, and Truman, and Ronald Reagan. And here's Alice Bailey again in her externalization of the hierarchy. And she tells us that in place of Christianity, the mystery religions will be restored by the church and Freemasonry. And Manly P. Hall tells us, the genuine esoteric associations always required that disciples prepare themselves for careers of practical service. The student was expected to attain a state of unusual skill or proficiency in some branch of learning. He was then to practice this profession or craft as a means of extending his sphere of constructive influence. He was to teach through example, enriching his chosen vocation with the overtones of enlightened religious philosophy, thus gradually creating a significant zone of influence. He was available for whatever task the keepers of the great plan required. So if you're a member of a group like Freemasonry, they want you to work towards this goal of one world government and the New Age that they call the Great Plan. And Alice Bailey tells us how they're going to do this. She says, by means of the educational work of the world, the Great Lord, who she refers to in this book as Lucifer, seeks to reach those of the intelligent public who cannot be reached by means of ceremonial and symbolism as in Masonry, or by religious means and rituals as in the church. It touches the masses and those in whom the intelligent aspects predominate. What she's telling us here is, and we'll read it again in this next one, is the three main channels through which the preparation for the New Age is going on might be regarded as the church, the Masonic fraternity, and the educational field. We're going to get them in the churches to bring in this New Age. But not everybody goes to church. So we'll teach them in the fraternities. But not everybody goes to a Masonic lodge. So then the safety net for it all is education. We're in a period of what is called externalization of the hierarchy. They're taking what was done in secret 100 years ago and they're externalizing what was done by the hierarchy in secret into society. So that's why when I go down the street and I get a meal at a fast food place, here is a wizard doing magic with Lilith, the owl, and throwing energy balls on my hamburger sack. And then I go down the street, and here's an identical looking wizard and fire and ice, which are important symbols in the occult. And then I go to the next fast food place, and this is their placemat, and it blows me away. How to hypnotize your parents. And then I go on to the library, and they're handing this out as you go through the door, Metaphysics for Our Age. And I look inside the library book, and they have the symbol for the Illuminati, a snake swallowing its tail, and it says Illumino. And then I find out that it's Freemasons running our libraries and our school system. And I go to the laundromat, and here's a lady who's channeling demons, and she's going to teach how to use your spiritual energy, and she's teaching this in the Portland Masonic Temple. And I come home and I think, well, it's safe to read the food section in the paper at least. And here's a witch teaching witchcraft in the food section. Now, I told you that they're going to use education to bring in the externalization of the hierarchy. My wife is taught in a public school, and this public school for the last 15 years has had nothing to do with Christmas. They have an occult ritual winter solstice program during that time period. And in 1991, this was the program that they gave the parents who came to a meeting like this to watch their children put on the play. And they celebrated the return of Lucifer. And inside, this is the program. And the children on stage, some of them had acceptable barcodes on their foreheads, and some of them had unacceptable barcodes on their foreheads. And by the way, I happened to send this one day to Tex Mars, and he put it on the front of his newsletter. Now, getting back to Alice Bailey, she says, the Masonic movement will meet the need of those who can and should wield power as the custodian of the law, is the home of the mysteries, and the seat of initiation. It holds in its symbolism the ritual of deity, and the way of salvation is pictorially preserved in its work. The methods of deity are demonstrated in its temples, and under the all-seeing eye, the work can go forward. It is a far more occult organization than can be realized, and is intended to be the training school for the coming advanced occultists. In its ceremonials lies hid the welding of the forces connected with the growth and life of the kingdoms of nature and the unfoldment of the divine aspects of man. If you're an Illuminati boy, the Illuminati wants you to go through Freemasonry to learn the outer symbols of the mystery religions. But the real hardcore rituals of the mystery religions are reserved for Illuminati rituals, or some of the higher rites of Freemasonry. This is a cover of one of the Scottish Rites magazines. The Supreme Council of 33rd Degree, their official magazine, has been known as the New Age magazine for 100 years. They've been promoting the New Age movement for a long time. In the 70s and 80s, Christians were still debating whether there was a New Age movement. And in the inside of this magazine is a page which has a very interesting quote. As stated before, God's plan in America is a non-sectarian plan. Our Constitution is non-sectarian. Our great American public schools, God's chosen schools, are non-sectarian. The great spirit behind the great nation is non-sectarian. Our great American public schools have never taken away from any child the freedom of will, freedom of spirit, or freedom of mind. That is the divine reason that great God, our King, has chosen the great American public schools to pave the way for the new race, the new religion, and the new civilization that is taking place in America. Any mother or father or guardian who is responsible for the taking away of freedom of mind, freedom of will, or freedom of spirit is the lowest criminal on this earth, because they take away from that child the God-given right to become part of God's great plan in America for the dawn of the new age of the world. They're saying, shame on you, Christian parents, for sending your kids to Christian school. You are the lowest criminal on earth. And here is Lucius Trust, just a letter from them indicating that their triangles groups are in 110 countries. This is from another Masonic magazine. It says, Masonry's greatness is not in the antiquity of its beginnings, neither in its conservatism, but rather in the fact that it has always been a leader of thought and action. I repeat, a comprehensive understanding of the history of Masonry leads inevitably to the conclusion that not through conservatism has it most served the world, but rather through its spirit of unrest, its utter abhorrence of unnecessary restraint, its abiding love for liberty, its unconquerable desire to progress away from the old to the new and better conditions. Wherever the conflict has been waged between the old and the new, between a narrow conservatism and real progress, our Masonic brethren have been found on the right side. Witness the members of St. Andrew's Lodge of the Green Dragon who threw the tea into Boston Harbor. I wish I had $1 for every time that I have heard someone talk about the Boston Tea Party being a tax revolt against high taxes. What actually happened? British Parliament drastically slashed taxes. So why would people revolt against that? Well, the people didn't. But the Masons at that time period were smuggling opium into this country in the bottom of ships. They were also smuggling in tea. And when British Parliament drastically cut import taxes, it made their illegal tea uncompetitive with the legal tea. And they were upset that this was going to cut into their profit. So when they were going to have their lodge meeting that night at the Green Dragon Inn, and you might remember that name for later on it might come up, they decided, and if you look in the minutes of their lodge meeting, you will see that they decided to cancel their meeting that night, and they planned to dress up as Indians, and then they went down to Boston Harbor, and there was this poor captain who was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and they dumped millions of dollars of his, however much it was, of his tea right into Boston Harbor. It was a criminal act, and now history has been tweaked a little bit, and we see them as great patriots. This is from a map that I did, just showing Masonic lodges during the Revolutionary time period. The Freemasons were the ones who planned and carried out a large share of the American Revolution, and 33 of the 35 signers of the Declaration were Freemasons. There are over 800 fraternal organizations in this nation. Essentially all of them have been started by the Freemasons. Many religious groups and religions have been started by the Freemasons. And if we look at this Scottish Rite Journal page, we see that they say Freemasonry has a world power. And they see this in 1921, when this was written, that there was a struggle between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church. This was one of those many controlled struggles that the Illuminati has given us. Well, it's no longer that situation anymore. In 1993, in one of my newsletters, I listed hundreds of top Vatican officials and their initiation dates and their secret Masonic membership numbers. This is just a small section of the list. And here's the Catholic Church with the Illuminati all-seeing eye in it. Now there are a number of top 13 families. You've got Astor, Bundy, Collins, DuPont, Freeman, Kennedy, Lee, Onassis. Now, Reynolds is not one of the top 13, but it's close up there. Rockefeller, Rothschild, Russell, and then you've got your 13th Illuminati bloodline, which is the Merovingian bloodline, which believes that they are descendants of Christ and descendants of Lucifer in the House of David. And you've got the Van Dyne family. So these are your top Illuminati families. Now, we're going to take a break from getting an overview of things, and we're going to focus in on just one little time point in history, the Civil War, and we're going to look at 3 men at that time period. This is so that we can see how the small relates to the big. We're going to look at Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, and John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist who tried to arm the slaves, and by doing so provoked the South to want to have an armed rebellion. Abraham Lincoln ran on an anti-slavery platform, and his election provoked the South to secede, and Ulysses S. Grant was Lincoln's best general and the greatest Civil War hero. Now, the Illuminati wanted to create an American Civil War. The United States was getting too big and too rich, so they wanted to divide and conquer. And they wanted to bring us into debt and create a national bank. And they were also looking forward to all the war profits that they were going to get running drugs and munitions and other things, but they needed people to implement their plan. And we're only going to look at 3 people, and of those we can only give, due to time, a fraction of what could be said. So let's look at the first person. Let's look at John Brown. John Brown was a Rosicrucian and a Mason, and so was his father. Now, there was a Rosicrucian named William Lloyd Garrison, and he created the Anti-Slavery Society in 1832. He also became a member of the Order of the Rose in England in 1834. There was another Rosicrucian, George Lippard, who was a member of the Brethren of Light, and it was he who taught John Brown to be rabidly anti-slavery. Now, John Brown didn't know much about the Scriptures, but he was traveling through a Mormon settlement, which ties into all of this, but we can't go into it, and they taught him their blood atonement doctrine, where you pay for the sin with your own blood. And so he thought in his warped mind that if somebody sinned or he did something he didn't like, that gave him the right to blow them away with a shotgun, for the wages of sin is death. John Brown was a murderer, and so was his sons. But he was a common man. He only became what he became because he had a conspiracy behind him. Now, there was a club, the Bird Club, that met in Young's Hotel in Boston, Massachusetts. And one of the members of the Bird Club, Senator Charles Sumner, went over to Europe and visited with leading Illuminati kingpins. For instance, Giuseppe Mazzini. And he came back then and got the Bird Club organized into a group, to a conspiracy to arm John Brown. Several of the members of the Bird Club were Unitarian pastors who appeared as pacifists while they were sending supplies and guns to John Brown. For instance, we had Unitarian Reverend Higginson and Unitarian Reverend Parker. And then there was Unitarian George Stearns, who manufactured lead pipe. If you know how poisonous water is when it's put through lead pipe. And then there was Garrett Smith, who was an Illuminati multimillionaire whose father was best associate with John Jacob Astor I, another Illuminati kingpin. And then they not only set up this secret group to help John Brown, but they pulled their establishment media in line, and so groups like, papers like the New York Times, who had Karl Marx as their correspondent, built John Brown up into a hero. And they sent over a professional revolutionist, a Jewish Freemason named Amschel Bondi, who helped John Brown in places like Bleeding, Kansas, and when he was done, then went over into other places in the world to help with other Masonic inspired revolutions. Now let's look at Ulysses Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was born and named Hiram Grant. He was named after the Masonic sun god Hiram Abiff, and his father was a master mason and a leader of a lodge. His father's name was Jesse Root Grant. Where have we heard the Root name? Remember Elijah Root and Colonel House? Jesse Root Grant worked for John Brown's father. And when he quit working for John Brown's father, he started working for E.A. Collins. Well, who are the Collins family? The Collins family is one of the top 13 Illuminati bloodlines. Remember the Pilgrims? The Pilgrims are one of the Puritan groups that came over to New England. When the Puritans came over, there were groups of witches that came over with them. Frances Collins, who came over with one of the early groups of Puritans, was a witch. These witches came over. Now remember, in New England, the state supported the churches. They taxed the people and then gave money to the churches. So it was advantageous to be an establishment, state-sponsored church. So the churches that the witches set up and belonged to, they called themselves the same names as the Puritan churches, which was Congregational and Presbyterian. But after the Civil War, around 1824, the state quit giving these churches money, and so it no longer was advantageous to continue the name, and so the witches created the Unitarian Church. Well, one of the Collins started the Unitarian Church, which in turn started Yale and Harvard. And there were Illuminati secret societies at Yale before they brought in the Order of the Skull and Bones. Now, an example of a Unitarian minister who is also Illuminati is Karl Fohlen. He created their Bund der Jugend in Europe, and which was Illuminati front, which also operated behind another Illuminati front, the Swiss Bible Society. But when things got too hot, he came over to Harvard and taught as a Unitarian minister. There was another man that was active, noteworthy to note, James Anderson Collins. He was also busy working with Unitarians, Rosicrucians, Masons, and Socialists to create a civil war. Now, the Collins family in the 1700s branched into the Todd family, and they also branched into the Putnam families, and they also branched into the Grant family, which then branched into the Wheeler family. Now, to show you that there is a connection between the Civil War and the present time period, if we look at Grant was the top military man of his day, and then in the Civil War, and then during the Vietnam era, his descendant, General Earl Grant Wheeler, was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States. Now, General Earl Grant Wheeler was a member of the Illuminati, and he was also a member of the Collins family via the Ulysses Grant bloodline. And General Earl Grant Wheeler had a brother named Ulysses Grant Wheeler, who had a son who was born on the day after the Illuminati High Climax ritual, and that son was named Leo Wheeler, and Leo Wheeler became a Grand Master in the Illuminati. Now, the Vietnam War was created by the Illuminati to create a drug culture in the United States. They moved the American boys over to a country where there was lots of easy access to lots of drugs, and got a lot of American boys hooked on drugs. But they also smuggled drugs into the United States, and the Army was in full cooperation, parts of it, with the Illuminati drug smuggling. And so while you had at the head of the Army, you had General Earl Grant Wheeler and his co-worker Satanists like McNamara helping smuggle drugs on the West Coast, then you had Illuminati Grandmaster Leo Wheeler coordinating the drug running. Now let's go back to General Grant. Ulysses Grant was, as a boy, a very unkempt, unpromising boy. He wasn't very intelligent, and nobody could think of anything for his future. He was unpromising, but his father had connections, so he got him an appointment to West Point. The town that General Grant came from, Georgetown, had a lot of political pull behind it. there were, at the outbreak of the Civil War, 4 generals in the Union Army from Georgetown and 1 colonel. And then in the volunteer units that Lincoln raised, there were 9 more generals from that little village of barely 1,000 people. And all in all, you had 20 leading Union officers from this little village. Now, General Grant himself, he entered the Union Army on April 23rd, 1861 as a private. And on August 7th, 1864, he was made Supreme Commander over all the Union forces. And that was antedated back to May 17th, 1864. So from April of 61 to May of 64, 3 years, he went from being a private to Commander-in-Chief of the entire Union Army. Later he became president. So this man who was a gutter drunk when the Civil War broke out became president, and he selected 8 Masons as his cabinet, and one of the men on his cabinet was Columbus Delano of the ancient aristocratic black noble family Delano. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a descendant of that same Delano family. And there was another man on Grant's cabinet, that was Alphonso Taft, who was the blood father of Bill Clinton. And Grant selected as his advisor Jonas Mills Bundy of the Bundy Illuminati family, and Jonas Bundy was also the advisor to the next 2 presidents. And if we come forward in time, we'll see that McGeorge Bundy was the advisor of the President Kennedy and Johnson, and Harvey Bundy, also of the Bundy Illuminati family, was head over the Manhattan Project. Now let's look at Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks, was visiting Lincolnton, North Carolina, when she was impregnated by A.A. Springs. A.A. Springs was a descendant of the Rothschilds, and the Springs had changed their name from Springstein to hide their genealogy, to hide their Rothschild blood. Now, this man here, Leroy Springs, was Abraham Lincoln's half-brother, and he worked for Louis Cass-Payzer, who was one of the most powerful men in the United States of his time. His descendants are still very powerful and are still unknown. He was of the Merovingian dynasty, the 13th Illuminati bloodline. In fact, it was the Payzer family that owned Jekyll Island, where they created the Federal Reserve. Now, Abraham Lincoln became the top Rosicrucian in the United States, and he was a member of the Order of the Lily, which uses the fleur-de-lis as its logo, which is the Merovingian logo. And he married a Todd. Remember, I told you that the Todd family was a branch from the Collins family. And she conducted rituals, seances, in the White House, which Lincoln sometimes participated in. And Abraham Lincoln, as president, selected as his attorney Bart Moore of the Beatty Illuminati family. And a descendant from that Beatty Illuminati family is Shirley MacLaine. Salmon P. Chase was made his Secretary of Treasury. Now, if you look on the $10,000 bill, the highest denomination, you'll see Salmon P. Chase's picture, and Chase Manhattan, of which the Rockefellers are associated with, was named after Salmon P. Chase. Salmon P. Chase, while he was a secretary for Lincoln, introduced a national bank and graduated income tax for us, which is what Karl Marx had been advocating in his writing. And Lincoln's cabinet got involved with an Illuminati European company called the Credit Mobilier, which was scamming to the American people, and a scandal broke out, and the American people found out that Lincoln's cabinet had scammed them out of $23 million. Now, Lincoln was having a sexual liaison with King Leopold's daughter, and he had a set of twins, Ella and Emily. That doesn't mean that Lincoln was necessary promiscuous, but you will find in a lot of these high-level Illuminati families that they have a lot of secret offspring. And one last note about General Grant, he was best of friends with the Chinese Li family. General Li of the Li Chinese family was best of friends with General Grant, and then he in turn, General Li, who was known as the Bismarck of the East, was best of friends with the German Illuminati Krupp family.